Just over a century ago, the motion camera was invented and changed forever the way we recall our history. For the first time, we could see life through the eyes of ordinary people. Across this series, we'll bring these rare archive films back to life with the help of our vintage mobile cinema. We'll be inviting people with a story to tell to step on board and relive moments they thought were gone forever. They'll see their relatives on screen for the first time, come face to face with their younger selves, and celebrate our amazing 20th century past. This is the people's story, our story. Our vintage mobile cinema was originally commissioned in 1967 to show training films to workers. Today it's been lovingly restored and loaded up with remarkable film footage, preserved for us by the British Film Institute and other national and regional film archives. In this series we'll be travelling to towns and cities across the country and showing films from the 20th century that give us the real history of Britain. Today we're pulling up in the 1930s to hear stories about a time when millions of men, women and children, our relatives, were slum dwellers living in squalor. We're in Columbia Road in the East End of London. Look at it. Gentrified, well-heeled, on the up and up. But in the 20s, 30s, 40s and into the 50s, this was one of the slum regions of London. Coming up, two cousins see how their grandfather suffered in the slums.
That's the terrible part, I always think. It's not that long ago that people lived like that.
How are you? A reminder that love can matter more than money.
Yeah. They say, how could you have had such a great childhood, loved it so much, when you lived in such dire poverty?
And an incredible story about life in the workhouse.
We've all got to die sometime, and that world will leave with us unless it's recorded.
Today on Real History, we've come to Columbia Road in the East End. There's a famous Sunday flower market here these days, and it's a popular residential area. But only 80 years ago, around 20,000 families lived in poverty in this part of London. During the Industrial Revolution, the population of Britain's cities exploded, and the nation's housing stock struggled to keep up. Up to 4 million people lived in slum squalor across the country. Many families were crammed into one or two rooms. They were cold, damp, vermin-infested and lacked basic sanitation. Often as many as 60 people shared one lavatory. Many children didn't survive, and in the worst areas, almost 1 in 5 died before their first birthday. We've come to the East End of London to hear how people lived like this not that long ago. Joining me here today are former slum residents and their families from all over the country, with stories to tell about the harrowing conditions they endured. Many of them will be seeing the films we're about to screen for the first time. They'll be showing us family photos and revealing what life was really like for millions of slum dwellers in the 1930s. Carole Taylor and Pat Couch are cousins. Their mothers were sisters who grew up in a family of 10 children in a Stepney tenement block. This is Carole with her mother Adelaide, and this is Pat with her mother Kate. They've come here today to see a remarkable film of Adelaide and Kate's father, Charles Norwood, the grandfather they themselves remember as children.
He was matter of fact about everything, really. That was his attitude always, wasn't it?
But I think they had to be, didn't they?
Go with the flow,
because
innit?
they would go under if they wouldn't cope at all.
He was 83, wasn't he, when he died?
Yeah.
82?
82, yeah. He lived longer
And
than
he still lived in the East End the whole time, really.
It's quite touching to think,
Yeah.
when you think it's not that long ago, is it?
Yeah.
That's the terrible part, I always think. It's not that long ago that people lived like that.
Carole and Pat are about to watch their grandfather taking part in a pioneering documentary made in 1935.
A great deal these days is written about the slums. This film is going to introduce you to some of the people really concerned.
Housing Problems was one of the first documentaries to use a technique that seems obvious now, but was almost unheard of at the time, asking the opinions of ordinary people. Among them was Carole and Pat's grandfather.
These 2 rooms which I am in now, I have to pay 10 shillings a week for, and I haven't a room to swing a cat round. I've also got 5 other neighbours alongside of me with the same predicament as I'm in myself. And I'm not only overrun with bugs, I've got mice and rats. If we want to wash the baby, we have to use the dish and use it in the same room as where I am.
Carole and Pat's grandfather was living like millions of other families in appalling, cramped conditions. So how do they feel, hearing him talk about his life in the slums?
Well, it's a bit choking, really, but yeah, it is like having him in front of you, and sitting in the sitting room with you. Yeah, nice.
Coming into these rooms, I've had no luck since I've been in.
It's obvious if you've got a big family like that, you're living in a couple of rooms, you've got a pretty hard life.
Pat and Carole's grandfather worked guiding boats into the docks on the Thames. Watching him as he once was, a young working man before they were born, is an emotional moment for his granddaughters.
You really feel for them living like that. It's sad, really, and not that they had any choice, really, but it's still not nice to watch, is it? When you see them rats and God knows what, gee, they just take it in their stride, didn't they?
It's nice that you're hearing the people speak. You've got photographs, but to actually
Not
see
quite the same,
a
is it?
moving picture and then actually the voice as well, that's really lovely.
Yeah, it does. It brings it alive, doesn't it? Yeah. More grandad, really, than just a photo. Yeah.
Carole and Pat even glimpse their grandmother filling pans in the street, and they're about to hear a shocking revelation about the greatest tragedy their grandparents ever faced.
Coming into these rooms, I've had no luck since I've been in. First I lost one youngster in one, and I lost another youngster in another one 7 weeks after.
It was sad, but it was
a fact of life,
was a
wasn't it, really?
common occurrence. That's terrible to say that.
Yeah.
But
it happened all too often.
People,
Yeah.
I suppose, more or less expected they wouldn't all survive for one
I
reason
mean,
or
they were
another.
so close, those buildings, weren't they? Any disease was not going to go nowhere, was it? We've never had it put in front of us like that with that film. I mean, that does bring it home.
Yeah, the film does.
You know, I mean, they used to say they had hard life, they was poor, but it's until you see it like that, it doesn't really work out in your mind, does it, properly?
Seeing the film today has left Carole and Pat with one regret, that their mothers are no longer alive to take part in real history.
When I see that film, I think it would have been nice if this film had been done, say, 20 or 25 years ago, and then it would have been the right people sitting here.
What did you feel when you actually saw him up there?
Upset.
Oh, yeah?
Quite upset
yeah.
to think that
What
your
he'd gone
family,
through is sad, isn't it, really?
that your family went through all that.
But it is upsetting, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
to
to
see,
see.
you know, how they survived. Well, some of them didn't. 3 he lost, didn't he, Grandad?
The film Carole and Pat have just watched was made by 2 pioneering documentary filmmakers, Edgar Anstey and Arthur Elton. They were determined to shame the government into doing more to improve the slums. Joining me on Real History are Arthur's daughter Julia and Edgar's son John, who have joined us in the East End of London. They're both fiercely proud of their father's efforts to give slum dwellers a voice. What impact do you think the film had on housing problems?
I think getting the people to speak for themselves was really, for the first time, to give the working classes a voice that would be listened to, and in a sense validated their own experience.
It was certainly seen as an important opportunity to get a message across to the government, I suppose.
Working on the film with Anstey and Elton was Ruby Grierson. Here she is as a baby with her large family in 1905. The great thing here is that her older brother, John Grierson, grew up to become one of the best-known filmmakers of all time and inspired a new age of social documentary.
I have a story that Ruby Grierson, John Grierson's youngest sister, who also worked on the film, she's supposed to have said to the people, you've got the microphone, you've got the camera, now tell the bastards what it was like to live in the East End.
John and Julia are now going to watch their father's film with the families of some of the people who feature in it.
I must have dozed off with the baby. Thinking it was a dog on my head, I looked up. Instead of that, it was a big rat. I screamed and ran out and left the baby.
The people in this film knew all about rats. They were a serious threat to public health, spreading dangerous diseases like salmonella, Weil's disease and TB. And the residents of Stepney shared their fears with the camera.
This is what Mrs. Hill has to say.
So I'll tell you, we're fed up. If anybody comes to see you, they say they feel bilious when they get down the stairs because it's all crooked. You go up the stairs, you don't know whether you're coming down again or not. Same with the passage, that's all the same on the crook. In fact, everything in the house is on the crook. There's not a straight thing in it.
Housing problems, it seems to me, has this immediacy because you actually hear these people who are not sorry for themselves, they're just telling the camera what their life experience was, and I find that very moving.
But it wasn't just prominent filmmakers that documented the lives of the slum dwellers. I'm meeting the writer and poet Bernard Copps, who has written about his own life in these slums. Bernard Copps' family were European Jews who came to the East End at the turn of the last century. His whole family of 9 lived in cramped conditions. They didn't have money, but he had brothers and sisters and a lot of love. How are you?
Fine.
Very good.
Well, lovely day.
Yeah. So this is sort of your patch, isn't it, really?
Yep. From the age of 11 onwards, I lived just round the corner from here. I had a marvellous childhood. And people laugh at this, because they say, how could you have had such a great childhood, loved it so much, when you lived in such dire poverty? I worked out like this later on. I thought the reason why I was happy was that I had sisters who used to fight to hold me. When I was born, I was the boy, the young one. My sister Phoebe would say, you've held him for 10 minutes now, it's my turn. So I think that alone was very important. I was born with such competence.
Did you think, I've got to get out of this?
Yes.
And how did you get out of it?
I had a very important meeting with a neighbour. And he was a boy who was well educated. He'd won a scholarship. And he gave me a book. And it was the collected poems of Rupert Brooke. And it turned me on to reading. I became voracious to read. At the same time, I became voracious to get away. So those two things came into one.
It's uplifting to think that despite the poverty and misery, people like Bernard do have happy memories of life in the slums. All around the country in the 1930s, slum dwellers made the best of it. And my next guest on Real History Today coped with more than most. 91-year-old Stan Hardy from Dulwich has come along to share his own extraordinary past as a child in the Peckham workhouse. He believes people need to know how tough life could be. For the first time, Stan's about to see his old life on screen. What memories will it bring back for him?
It brings me back to the terrible conditions in which so many people lived. Kids scavenging around the streets for, real scavengers, and I was probably one of them as well. A bit of a shock to be reminded how brutal things were.
Stan's early life was indeed brutal. He had an absent father, and his mother was forced to start a job in service when he was newborn. There was only one thing for it. She took him to the workhouse and left him there.
I was carried into the Peckham workhouse when I was just 2 weeks old, and my mother left me in the workhouse, and I remained in the workhouse for some 3 years or more.
Workhouses, commonly known as poor houses in Scotland, date back to the 17th century. They were grim places, a last resort for Britain's destitute, which offered shelter and employment for those unable to look after themselves. Only still photographs remained of the institutions everybody feared. They were officially abolished in 1930, but incredibly, there are almost 100,000 people still living in the workhouse in 1939, and almost 6,000 of these were children, like Stan.
When people became destitute, in other words, they couldn't afford to look after themselves, they'd lost their accommodation, there was only one place to go, or the only place to go was the workhouse. There was certain brutality in the workhouse, particularly if you didn't have a parent to keep an eye over you. I can remember being bashed around quite a bit, and as I was bashed around, I used to grip my hands like that. The more they hit me, the harder I did. So I used to make my hands bleed because I wasn't going to let them get away with it.
Stan did return to live with his family in the slums of Brixton, and these films take him right back to that place.
In my family's case, there were 5 adults and myself. We were in one of these multi-occupied houses. There was about 15 people in our house with one outdoor toilet, which nobody used because they had 2 savage Alsatian dogs who would have eaten us alive if they could run free. Hygiene was a tremendous problem with rats and mice and bugs. Terrible bugs, these red little things, and they get into your skin, and you see them coming up the wall, and people used to bash them. You see all the blood spots on the wall.
Figures from the 1920s, when Stan was just a kid, shows that every year almost 50,000 people died as a direct result of their squalid living conditions.
One of the great killers was TB, where 30,000 people died a year with TB. My poor brother Jimmy, he died of TB when he was only 18 years of age. So I have sad recollections of that.
The films have reminded 91-year-old Stan of his childhood hardships. But has this been a worthwhile experience for him?
It was really an emotional journey back, which I didn't quite expect, because it showed in stark detail how we lived in those days. And I have to say, some of the people led even harsher lives than I did, and that's saying something. So it was an emotional journey back. We've all got to die sometime, and that world will leave with us unless it's recorded.
Today on Real History, we're hearing about the appalling conditions people like Stan endured less than 3 generations ago. Millions of families lived in slum communities in cities across Britain. But despite the squalor, community spirit did endure, as remembered by childhood friends Roger Packer and Brian Davies, who grew up in the St Philip's Marsh area of Bristol in the 1940s. Both men knew real poverty. Roger's grandfather was an iron worker, seen here at a works outing in 1938. Brian was one of 10 sons raised by a widowed mother. When did you two meet?
When we were about 4 to 5 years of age, and we grew up together. We've been friends ever since, and I got a picture of us when we were at school together.
Can we point out the suspects?
That's, there we are, that's myself.
That's yourself?
Yeah, and that there is Brian. Yeah. And we've been friends ever since.
This is a photograph of my family in the 1940s. My dad died in the 40s, and my mother was then left to bring up 10 boys in this house, and the Bristol Evening Post come along and took a photograph at that time and said, how was she ever going to bring up these 10 boys? But she obviously managed it.
She's done a very good job.
Yeah.
Roger and Brian are about to be taken on a journey back in time to see the sort of life they knew as children. But how will they feel now, seeing it as adults? Watching the films, Roger remembers a strong sense of community despite the hardships.
I can remember a lot of times like that with the housing, the poor kiddies down there, the youngsters and all that, who didn't have anything at all. You know, the little cobbled streets, little narrow streets and houses. Nobody had no more than the next person. You could go out on a night time, or you could leave your front door open. Nobody would pinch anything, because nobody had nothing to pinch, really.
And for Roger's friend, Brian, these films remind him of his cramped early home life.
We had these bedrooms to fit 12 every night. And so we used to try and fit these people in this bedroom. So it was done by 2 double beds in the back room, 2 double beds in the front room, top to tail in both. When they were around the fire eating, you know, I said in a run room, that was us. And 10 of us used to get in that room, and we had a big fire with a guard going round, and that was the only eating in the whole room or in the house. So everybody used to try and get their bit in front of the fire, you know.
Brian has never forgotten his humble beginnings, but he thinks it helped give him the drive to work for a better life.
There's nothing good about being poor. I think somebody once said, it's nothing to be ashamed of being poor, but it's nothing to boast about either. And I mean, one of the things that I particularly wanted was not to be poor.
With her 10 boys to bring up single-handedly, Brian's mother was at the front of the queue when the clearance of her Bristol slum began.
We were one of the first, because of our conditions, to move, but it was a bit of a shock. I mean, the street I lived in had sort of 35 houses at one side, 35 terraced houses the other, and I could tell you, even almost today, who lived in every one of those houses. So we knew everybody. And for us to be the first out was quite something of occasion.
The 1930 Housing Act gave local authorities power to demolish homes unfit for human habitation, a process known as slum clearance, which occurred nationwide. In Leeds, 10,000 homes were demolished. In Sheffield, close to 15,000. And in Bristol, almost 20,000 people were rehoused, just like Brian's family.
Sometimes I think we're the blessed generation, because when we left, we really could financially and job and everything else wise go up, where it's slightly different to that there. That was one of the nice things about it. You always I thought, God, we could get better than this. And it was a lovely feeling, that.
Today I've been hearing about the awful living conditions, the poverty and disease, and the remarkable people, like Brian and Roger, who against all the odds survived the slums and thrived. But amazingly, some slum dwellers didn't want to leave their homes. I'm off to meet housing expert and writer Michael Collins to try to find out why.
Despite the state of the buildings people lived in, there was that sense of community. There was a neighbourhood and there was a culture that had grown up organically, and so a lot of people felt that was sacrificed if they moved out or if they moved away or if they moved to these new places.
The 1930s saw the clearance of more slums than at any time previously, and the building of 700,000 new homes.
So when you had some of the new homes built, a lot of the people that occupied the slums, they didn't want to move to the new places, and they kind of almost embraced the idea of staying put. And there's a quote that the slum dweller loves his slum too much.
Ultimately, it was Hitler and the widespread bombing of our major cities during the Second World War that flattened many slums and left no option but to build new homes. It still took until the 1960s, but the arrival of high-rise housing finally consigned Dickensian slum conditions to history. You may think there's been quite a bit of nostalgia in this programme, but this country's full of it. Whatever class, whatever background, whichever place in the country we are nostalgic. But let's leave that in the past. What happened here was that a disgrace of life, the slums, was erased. We still have housing problems today, but we recognise that decent housing is a basic human need, and that's progress. Next time on Real History, we're hitting the road to Somerset for the rise of the motorway in the 60s.
It was also very free. There was no sort of speed limit, so you could see if you could get some speed out of it.
Next on BBC Two, an educational forensic examination takes place in the Dragon's Den. Making the perfect pie at 8, pork and meringue, though not together, on the Great British Bake Off, and a new series at 9 as the hairy bikers breathe new life into Meals on Wheels.